The parting of the ways. Some of the chief players in the drama of Indian affairs had changed. In April 1926, Lord Irwin had arrived as Viceroy. In 1924, Lord Birkenhead had become Secretary of State for India in the Baldwin government. Like Jinnah, Lord Birkenhead had never been intimidated by authority. He also had scored many victories over judges in the law courts. During 4 years as Secretary of State, he had become impatient with the long delays and arguments of the partisans in India, especially with their boycott of the Simon Commission. He was a pessimist over the future of India. He had written to Lord Reading on 4 December 1924, "To me it is frankly inconceivable that India will ever be fit for dominion self-government." A month later he had written, "In ultimate analysis, the strength of the British position is that we are in India for the good of India." He believed also that the Hindus and Muslims were irreconcilable, and he wrote, "All the conferences in the world cannot bridge the unbridgeable." Nevertheless, early in 1928, he challenged the Indians to produce their own scheme for a constitution, instead of always indulging in mere destructive criticism of the government. The challenge led first to an all-parties conference in Bombay. From this, a committee was appointed under Pandit Motilal Nehru, father of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. The report of the committee was published in August while Jinnah was still in Paris, and it was then placed before the members of a unity conference at Lucknow. A copy reached Jinnah at Aden on his way home. His comment on landing at Bombay was cautious. He said that he had not yet had enough time yet to digest the report. He supposed the signatories and various prominent men who met at Lucknow had made an effort towards Hindu-Muslim unity, and added, "One cannot help appreciating their great endeavor." That this typical proviso, however, the narrow report and the decisions of the Lucknow conference are not like the laws of the Medes and Persians, the last word in the matter. Jinnah kept his last word for 2 months. On 28 December, 3 days after his 52nd birthday, he spoke before another all-parties conference in Calcutta. Between the time of the drafting of the Nehru report and its presentation at the conference in Calcutta, the Muslim League had drawn up a series of amendments which had been sent to the Nehru Committee. The main proposals were that, under any future constitution, a minimum of one-third of the elected representatives in both houses of the central legislature should be Muslims. Also, that residuary power should be vested in the provinces, thus ensuring that the Muslim majority provinces should be autonomous and not managed by a Hindu majority center. These moderate proposals had been ignored by the Nehru Committee, who had instead adopted the principle that wherever such reservation has to be made for the Muslim minority, it must be in strict proportion to its population. In a long speech, during which he repeated the demands of the Muslims with fine emphasis, Jinnah expressed his grief and disgust over the short-sighted policy of the Nehru Committee's recommendations, which would oust the Muslims from any fair part in India's political future. Jinnah said, "I am exceedingly sorry that the report of the committee is neither helpful nor fruitful in any way whatsoever. I think it will be recognized that it is absolutely essential to our progress that a Hindu-Muslim settlement should be reached, and that all communities should live in a friendly and harmonious spirit in this vast country of ours." He then spoke of majorities, apt to be oppressive and tyrannical, and of minorities with their dread and fear that their interests and their rights might suffer and be prejudiced. Then, with great skill, which is apparent even in the cold printed record of his speech, he repeated his demands: justice for the Muslim minority, and above all, unity. He warned the conference of the dangers of a constitution under which minorities felt insecure, of the inevitable result, revolution and civil war. This formidable prophecy, which came true 19 years later, did not impress his listeners. The first speaker to follow him, Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru, dragged Jinnah's appeal and warning into the dust of personalities. Although he was for giving him what he wanted, and he finished with it, he talked of him as a spoiled child, a naughty child. Among those who listened to Jinnah's speech was a Parsee, jamshed Nusserwanjee, who was to become the builder and the mayor of the new city of Karachi. This fine old gentleman, who has since died, was an admirer and a friend of Jinnah. He has said, "Yes, his memory is very beautiful to me. He was never a demonstrative person. He was reserved, dignified, and lonely. But I wish to tell you about the day in 1928, and it is a fine thing that I can tell you." Mr. Jinnah stood up wearing the fashionable clothes he had brought back from England, and he pleaded for his people. I knew the greatness of his heart. He believed that the Hindus and Muslims could be brought together. There was no hate in him. Some years later, after partition, he told me how much he wished the Muslims to be tolerant of the minorities in Pakistan. I beg you to believe that Mr. Jinnah was a humanitarian. He was never generous with tears. Oh no, but I saw him weep. Twice. Once was after partition, in January 1948, when I went with him to see an encampment of Hindus who had stayed on in Pakistan. When he saw their misery, he wept. I saw the tears on his cheek. His cheeks were very noble. The first time I saw him weep was after his amendments had been rejected at the Calcutta meeting to consider the Nehru report in 1928. It is a fine thing that he did, pleading as a great man for his people. His demands were rejected. One man said that Mr. Jinnah had no right to speak on behalf of the Muslims, that he did not represent them. He was sadly humbled and he went back to his hotel. About 8:30 next morning, Mr. Jinnah left Calcutta by train, and I went to see him off at the railway station. He was standing at the door of his first class coupe compartment and he took my hand. He had tears in his eyes as he said, "Jamshed, this is the parting of the ways." During the days of struggle that led to this parting of the ways, Mrs. Jinnah was dangerously ill at the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay. 2 months later, she died, not yet 29 years old. Jinnah was away from Bombay, but he hurried back for the long burial service in the Muslim cemetery, and he sat behind the mourners, with Kanji Dawarkhatas beside him. After a tense silence, he began to talk hurriedly of his political worries. Kanji Dawarkhatas did not answer. When the body was lowered into the earth, Jinnah abandoned his defenses. He bowed his head and sobbed. Jinnah went back to his house on Malabar Hill to the chill comfort of being alone. He had to endure two griefs at once. His belief in Hindu-Muslim unity was shattered, and his marriage had ended in tragedy. In time, he was to ascend to greatness and power, but in 1929, there was no light to encourage him in such a hope. He remained in his bachelor house, increasing the solitariness from which he was never to escape. When an old friend called to describe his wife's last hours, he saw a cold, discouraging look in Jinnah's eye and did not dare broach the subject. The pretty objects Mrs. Jinnah had brought for the house were packed away. Every photograph, every souvenir of the desperate years was removed. The only sign of mourning was the correct black band on the sleeve of Jinnah's coat. At a time when public failure and private grief might have overwhelmed him, a touching letter was written by the wife of a British officer who met Jinnah at a dinner party at Viceroyal Lodge in Shimla. Towards the end of May 1929, she wrote to her mother on the 29th. 75 covers were laid. All the gold plate was out, and the big gold bowls were filled with bright scarlet sweet peas. After dinner, I had Mr. Jinnah to talk to. He is a great personality. He talks the most beautiful English. He models his manners and clothes on Du Maurier, the actor, and his English on Burke's speeches. He is a future viceroy. if the present system of gradually Indianizing all the services continues. I have always wanted to meet him, and now I have had my wish.